Well, greetings, colleagues in Vietnam. We're really delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you remotely about new trends in the history of Japan. For those of you who are not part of our project, just to say a few words about that at the beginning, this is the Oregon-Vietnam Japan Collaboration and Exchange Project. It is funded by a generous grant from the Japan Foundation, 2017 to 2020. The project is all about promoting new directions in Japanese studies, and I can say as a participant in the project and a sponsor of the project right from the beginning that it's been incredibly gratifying to be able to collaborate with people in these four distinct places over the last few years. So today we're going to have a conversation with Professor Laura Hein. She is the Harold H. and Virginia Anderson Professor of History at Northwestern University. She's also an old and dear friend. She is an expert on lots of different things, but the center of her expertise is on post-World War II Japan. She's written any number of things over the years, and I'll only mention the highlights. A very influential book called Fueling Growth on the Post-War Japanese, Post-World War II Japanese Economy. Another on a group of economists who reached out to the public in the post-war period called Reasonable Men and Powerful Words. She's also been the co-editor of a number of different books that also will give you an indication of sort of her interests and of her passions that have to do with public memory, that have to do with remembrance, particularly after World War II. One called Living with the Bomb, about the atomic bombings, obviously. A second called Censoring History, which is not only about Japan, but also about Germany and the United States in the post-war period, related, among other things, to the textbook controversy that continues to rage in Japan about the way in which the war has been remembered in schools, particularly. And then finally, a book called Islands of Discontent, which is about Okinawan responses to Taiko, who is a visual artist whose artistry articulates concerns about social justice. In addition to those things, in her spare time, what there is of it, she is on the board of the journal Critical Asian Studies. She's also one of the main editors of the Asia Pacific journal, Japan Focus. And then directly relevant to what we're going to be talking about today, she is the main editor of the new Cambridge History of Japan, which is just about to come out. And it's the contents of those volumes that we're going to focus on today, and in particular, new trends in the history of Japan. So with that, let me let Laura talk a bit about that project and about the modern history of Japan.
Very nice to be here. I'm sorry that we can't do it in person, but this is way better than nothing. So yes, the Cambridge History of Japan, it's not about to come out, it's about to be completed, and then it'll be another year after we actually turn it in. So almost done collecting all of the bits and pieces of it, and I'm working on the introduction of the modern volume now, which is the place where the things I say today will eventually be in print. And it's an opportunity to ask something like 86 people who work on Japan from the prehistoric period to the 21st century to write sort of interpretive essays about what they think is in most need of attention right now. Cambridge history is a genre that goes back to 1902, and it is traditionally mainly been political and economic history. So one of the things that we're doing is expanding that to all the other forms of history that have become more popular since 1902. And one of those is environmental history, which is, of course, really crucial to everything, not just history of Japan, but of anywhere right now. And there really the central insight is that people are not the only historical actors, and that other entities are also important. And so that includes living things like mosquitoes or wolves, but it also, or maybe even wheat crop, but it also includes things that are not alive, like the ocean. And so, for example, Brett Walker, who's really the leading environmental historian of Japan, has a really fascinating long essay on the ocean and the Pacific Ocean and the way in which it has shaped Japanese history. Because, of course, the currents of the ocean bring fish to Japan. So that's one reason why the diet has been very fish-centric for a very long time. It's also the Ring of Fire, which is the volcanic ridge that goes around the edge of the Pacific Ocean that's had a huge effect on Japan, and many other things as well. And so one of the kind of forms of analyses that you really see that didn't exist before was the way in which these non-human actors work together with humans to kind of co-create history. And that, I think, is really interesting and important. And then Mark Metzler, who's an economic historian, is doing much the same thing with a specific focus on energy. So he's looking especially at coal and also a little bit hydropower, so it meshes very nicely with Brett's work, and rethinking the economic development of Japan as a resource extraction issue. This isn't new precisely. If you go back to work that was being done in the 1970s and the 1980s, there was a lot of thinking about resource extraction. But it used to be that anyone who worked on economic history pretty much assumed that a larger economy was a good thing. So the real question is, what are the criteria by which economic output is being distributed? Who gets to enjoy the fruits of it? But no questioning that having a bigger economic pie, which is what the economists always use as their an analogy, it makes it easier to distribute more fairly, or to overlook somebody getting more than their fair share because you have enough. Well, now, if you think about resource extraction as causing global climate change, larger economy is actually a bad thing. And so that turning the goal of economics on its head like that really makes us rethink the past as well. And so this is something that I think is going to have a huge impact in the way that we think about the economic history of anywhere and the history of technology anywhere, and not just Japan, because if what we want is a smaller economic footprint, then that's a very different kind of goal than the reasons why we've looked at Japan in the past, because Japan was always famous as the first non-Western industrializer and successful advanced economy delivering a high standard of living to its people. Well, that's no longer a pathway to that final goal that anybody can look to for the future. So I think that's huge.
Well, that is really that's interesting, and I mean, I recognize from having just taught a course on Japan and the Pacific, exactly what you're talking about. This a whole new conversation now about the environment and about the economy, and it has all these kind of macrocosmic implications for the way that we see Japan. One of the things that you've also mentioned to me is that there's a kind of microcosmic dimension also to the new scholarship, where increasingly people are looking at local places and their relationship to the nation, and also to, obviously, to the Japanese Empire, if we're talking about the 20th century.
Well,
Could you talk a little bit about, what those new
let me
directions
start
are?
with in the opposite order, because another point about if you look at the economic development as resource extraction, it immediately places attention on Hokkaido, on the Asian mainland, on other places where Japan very early on, and for that matter, Southeast Asia, is getting its resources.
Mm-hmm.
And is, for example, using herring from the far north in the Tokugawa period, and then using it as fertilizer, and then going from there, and then mining phosphate and using that for fertilizer, and in general taking captured carbon from places other than the central area of Japan and using it to increase yields in Japan. So it's a kind of imperialist relationship that hasn't really been focused on before, although it fits on the model of other forms of extraction in any kind of imperial relationship. So that's, I think, one of the two ways you can really see empire meshing with this new scholarship. The other way is people.
Yeah.
And the kinds of things that people are being asked to do, go down into mines and get the phosphate out or get the coal out, travel from one place to another and reclaim land somewhere else. And this would be a place like Manchuria later on, but earlier Hokkaido, the northern islands, even farther north than Hokkaido, for example. And these rural populations who are traveling around, who are displaced by these activities, then go somewhere new as part of government policy to develop a new area, often with completely inadequate resources and support, and they fail, and then they go somewhere else again. And so Hiromi Mizuno is looking specifically at these rural migrants. And these would be people who would start in some of them were samurai who lost their stipends. And so they would start in, say, Satsuma in southern Japan. They'd go up to Hokkaido where it's freezing cold and they're not used to it.
So we're talking about the Tokugawa period now.
Yeah, and early Meiji as well.
Yeah.
So there were some Meiji, so these are official programs to move people from place to place. Lots of people went independently too. And so some of these people, then they went to Hokkaido, it didn't work. And so then their kids went to Manchuria. And then they got repatriated in 1945. Some of them went back to Hokkaido because they didn't have any place else to go, failed again, and then went to Latin America. So your Japan in the Pacific is a very specific set of people.
Yeah.
And it went on for a very, very long time and is quite a large program, more than I would have realized. And these would be coal miners, not just farmers. So after the Nikkei mine closed,
Yeah.
or it didn't close, but after they fired a lot of people for union activity in the early 1960s, a lot of those miners went to Latin America.
And where in Latin America were they going? Were they going to Peru? Were they going to
The miners, where did the miners go? I should know this because this Tomiyama Kayako, the
Yeah.
artist who you mentioned earlier, who just turned 99,
Wow.
she worked for the Coal Miners Union newspaper. And so she traveled to Latin America because they had gone, and she was curious to see what their life was like in their new, so I'm pretty sure it was Peru, but I've kind of forgotten. So localities. So in other words, the kind of attention to non-human actors and these kind of exchanges that are happening at a level that really involve people but aren't just about people, incorporates thinking about empire into it.
Yeah.
But it actually moves our attention away from formal political empire, because these are processes that are starting before that happens.
Yeah.
And continue after that happen. And also, if you focus on the movement of people or of resources, it doesn't map that neatly onto the political grid of a formal empire, even if you're including things like Manchuria, which is technically independent, but not really. But Latin America, no one ever thinks of that as being under Japanese control, and nobody in Japan ever seriously thinks about putting it under Japanese control. It's never going to happen. Everyone knows that from day one, and yet it's just as much part of this story as Korea or Taiwan is. So I think actually, in some ways, although the new scholarship is really making us think more about Japan's international relations and its hierarchical relations with other places, the formal concept of political empire is less important.
Yeah.
Even though the activities are taking place in those areas. So it's important as a location, but not as a concept compared to the way we thought about it in the past. It seems to me that's emerging. I think of it as James C. Scott's thin simplification. He's talking about a kind of modern society. And of course, he's thinking about Malaysia because that's his home research place, as well as the rest of the world. A kind of the most intense version of a really tightly organized, top-down, state-sponsored system. And maybe empire is that. So it's just an intenser version as opposed to a different kind of thing from other forms of modern political economic organization.
Well, this whole issue of where people fit in empire is fascinating, because obviously it's not just Japanese moving to other locations of Latin America or to to the South Pacific or wherever, and all the trading networks that they create, but it's also the movement of people from those areas under empire to other places within
and
Japanese empire.
And not so much that they're all coming to Tokyo as that they're all going everywhere. So there's a lot of periphery to periphery interaction. Like there's a huge number of Koreans in Manchuria, for example, and they aren't, students in Tokyo, that kind of thing is happening, just like students in Paris in the Francophone world all met each other. So yes, that kind of thing is happening too. But I would say the newest work is really emphasizing what's going on in the borderlands and in local places. So I wanted to get back to what you said about localities. So for one thing, of course, your own work on the mayor of Osaka is foundational for all of this. It's really the model for looking at localities within Japan. And there are other places like Okinawa, for example, that are fascinating because they're borderlands between Japan, China, Southeast Asia, and the global hegemons, like particularly the United States. And they're the legal and diplomatic relationships that Okinawa has with all of these places over the last 200 years, super complicated. And you can really see how different systems of government and transnational governance are butting up against each other in a place like that. So there's some things that these borderland places show us that you really can't see anywhere else. So the peripheral is central. But they also share with localities like Osaka how varied and imaginative and much more democratic local life is than national life. And I think one of the pictures of Japan that emerges is that there is a huge amount of really smart things happening at local levels that last for a long time, and it's really, progressive and fair and careful about the environment and not cruel. And then you get to the national government and the staggering lack of imagination and lack of a sense of realism is such a contrast. I mean, so, right now, Japan's biggest problem today is that its population is shrinking horribly.
Yeah.
And it's a very regionally differentiated one. So it's the countryside where this is happening. And, the truth is the same thing is starting to happen in most of the countries of Asia. China's well down that road already, and Korea and Vietnam are moving into a period of aging population. And the only way to address that is immigration. And Japan has really refused to do that. But because local areas, rural areas are the first to depopulate, this too is something that is taken seriously at places in, Gunma Prefecture in a way that it is not yet in Tokyo, or it is now, but it's kind of too late.
I see this really stark, distinction between rural and urban Japan after years and years of spending time in Osaka and Kyoto and Tokyo almost exclusively. A couple of years ago, took a trip way up north to Hakodate, and then from there traced the Japan Sea coast.
I've always wanted to do that.
It in some ways it's a kind of a cliche, but it's really, in some ways, it's like going into the Japanese past. You feel when you're in some of these regional cities, you can see how much they're struggling economically. You can almost see the depopulation of these cities, and it must be even worse in the countryside. And so there are people, I guess, who are writing about these kinds of things now.
So Yoshimichunya is a very well-known Japanese master of all things. He has an essay in the Cambridge History from one of the 3 books he published in May 2019. called Heisei Jidai, which is just a nice little short book about Japan in the era of the emperor who just stepped down, so 1989 to 2019. And he makes the point that population decline is so severe and it has gone on now so long that it is irreversible. Because here's what happens. If you have a small town and there are not enough kids to go to have an elementary school, all the remaining families with kids leave because they don't want their kids not to be able to go to school. So there's a kind of a tipping point where everybody who could be the future moves out, and then you just have old people left. And he says that's going to happen in a third of Japan's municipalities in the next 10 years.
So, you know, one of my mentors, of course, is Miyamoto Kenichi, who is an environmental economist. But one of his projects, in fact, has had to do with this directly. You know, he's been working with a particular village in Nagano to deal, for the last 20 years, really, to deal with this issue of depopulation. They were watching their village age, they're watching their village depopulated of younger people. He went in and offered them a kind of an ongoing seminar about how to regenerate their local economy. And it included, among other things, shifting from rice production to vegetables, which they could then market nationally. And he now, you know, ultimately, I think what they did was they actually built him a little second home in Nagano and said, as long as you're alive, you come here whenever you want with your family and friends.
That's sweet.
This is a huge issue.
So how did they keep young people there? By just...
Well, what they did, they didn't, initially at least, they didn't keep young people there. They brought young people back. So young people who had gone to Tokyo or had gone elsewhere to make a living, once they had children and they realized that there was a way to make a good living back in their hometowns, looked at that environment and said, this is where we want to raise our children. You know, so it wasn't by now it must be a situation in which those children are now coming of age themselves and will make that same decision. But the hope obviously is that they'll stay. Well, Laura, thanks so much for talking with us about these new trends in the history of Japan, and for participating so energetically and willfully in this Oregon, Vietnam, Japan project through the Japan Foundation. We really, really appreciate it. And greetings from me, from Jeff Haynes, here at the University of Oregon, to all of our colleagues in Vietnam and Japan. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.